What do you think? This is my new setup. Okay, it might be really echoey, and the lighting keeps changing because I'm using natural light. We'll see. But anyway, I have books and things and... Okay, I'm happy. In May, I had a lot of time to read because I was living with my parents for a few weeks while I was sorting out this flat, and so I read like 8 books and like 5 or 6 manga and comics, which is really cool. So let's steamroll through some of this cool stuff. This is what I read in May. I actually mentioned this at the end of my last wrap-up, and then I did a review of it at the very beginning of the month. This is All the Lovers in the Night by Miyako Kawakami, translated by Sam Bett and David Boyd from the Japanese. Miyako Kawakami is my favorite Japanese author. Everything she does is wonderful. She was just at an awards ceremony in London a few days ago for the International Booker Prize. She was shortlisted, and I adore her. When I did my review of this, however, I didn't do a great job. I've talked repeatedly recently about my current headspace, my depression, blah blah blah, and I don't think my review was very good. But I did a reading of the protagonist, an interpretation of her, and I got a few comments, and I was really grateful for that. I love my community, I love my corner of YouTube, I love generally the people that come and leave comments. It's a wonderful space, and I try to engage as much as possible. And I got a lot of really cool comments in that review, so in a way I'm grateful that it wasn't brilliant because I got some really good feedback, some really good comments and insights from people, so that was awesome. All the Lovers in the Night is also her most subtle book. It's not so loudly about anything. Her previous 2 books were very loudly about feminism, bodily autonomy, bullying. Bodily autonomy is a big one, and not just for women, but for all genders. She's really good at exploring that, and here, that is at its most subtle. It's still a politically and economically and socially driven book, but in a more quiet and subtle way. And I think that this is the kind of book that requires probably a few rereads to really understand the character, her motivations, her journey, her relationships, etc. Oh, it just got way too hot. Okay. Oh, I'm sweating. Okay, the next book I read in May, I don't have with me, but I did do a dedicated review of Ninth Building by Jinzer, translated by Jeremy Tiang, who did an amazing job. If you haven't watched that review, Ninth Building is a Chinese book by a very, very successful, lauded, celebrated playwright and screenwriter in China. But Ninth Building is a sort of fictionalized biography of his childhood and adolescence during Mao's Cultural Revolution. It's all true, it's all about his life, but it's written in a kind of fictional mode. It uses fiction writing techniques and tone and pacing to make it feel like a novel of sorts. But it very much is a biography. And Zhou Jingzi led a really, really interesting life, and the way that he structured it is in 2 halves, where the first half is his childhood in Beijing, second half he was exiled to the wastes of northern China as an adolescent. And these little vignette chapters just give you random moments in this life of his. It's structured in a way that it almost has a kind of moral of the story tone to it, where every little chapter vignette will tell you something that happened to him, something he experienced, and then at the end there's kind of a moral of the story. Something he learned, something he took away, something that molded him into the person that he is today, the artist that he is today, the celebrated, famous artist that he is today. It's a really, really exceptional book, and I need more people to read it. Published by my friends Honford Star, and everything they publish is always golden. Okay, I think this was the next thing that I read. This is The Wolf Den by Elodie Harper. The sequel to this just came out like a few days ago. So if you've read this and you don't know that the sequel is out, it is. This was another book that I did a dedicated video on, and again had some interesting replies in the comments, because when I read this, I had a list of things that I really loved about The Wolf Den, and one thing that rubbed me the wrong way, which was basically about classism and nepotism, and that was how I read it. And then I had quite a few people in the comments basically all saying the same thing, all agreeing with each other. That really opened my eyes about my faulty interpretation of the character and the events and what she went through. And I was really, really grateful. So grateful that I wanted to kind of go back to the beginning and read it with fresh eyes. And again, this is why I really enjoy my community. I really appreciated the input and the different perceptions that people have and had, and especially because I'm someone who kind of jumps a little too readily when it comes to things like classism, and I think I kind of jumped the gun a little bit, and I took a minute to think about it after the comments. I was like, yeah, that was such a good point, that was so great. So go watch that video and then read the comments, because it's such an interesting conversation going on. But The Wolf Den is great. The best thing about it is it's set in Pompeii about 2,000 years ago, and it's about a brothel full of sex workers, and our protagonist is one of those sex workers. The best thing is that it is a book about sex workers that is positive and enlightening and enriching, and sex workers are used as tools and props and less than human in so much fiction throughout history, and this book fixes that, and it puts them at the center of their own narrative, and I'm so grateful to Elodie Harper for that. Another book that I reviewed, and I don't have because I had a digital copy of it, was Lee Kotomi's Solo Dance, which was translated by one of my best friends, Arthur Ray G. Morris, and it was his debut literary translation, and he did such an incredible job. Lee Kotomi is a Taiwanese woman who lives in Tokyo. She writes in, I believe, both Japanese and Mandarin. This one was written in Japanese, and she translated it into Mandarin, I believe. Someone told me that. And it's a book about depression, it's a book about being queer, it's a book about abuse and suicide and literature. And I really, really needed it. As I've already mentioned, I've been very, very depressed recently. And I read that book and it felt like a hand on my shoulder. It felt like comfort. It felt like catharsis. It felt like empathy. It was empathy. And I really, really appreciated Lee Kotomi for just kind of appearing when I needed her to. Solo Dance is a very difficult book, but it's also a book that is sprinkled all the way through with hope and love and support. Whether or not you can kind of see that is almost up to you, but it's there. I loved Solo Dance so much, and I am just so grateful. This video will be going up on Friday, and on Saturday, so the day after this goes up, I'm actually interviewing Arthur over Zoom. It's an event that you can sign up for. I'll put the link in the description. I'm interviewing Arthur and Takumi Nieda, who is another translator, and I'll talk about her book in a second. I'll be interviewing both of them if you want to come join, and it'll be fun. To say any more about Solo Dance, though, would be kind of to spoil it, and you can go watch my video if you want more details, but Solo Dance helped me a lot. Thank you again to Arthur. I've said thank you already, but he did such a great job translating this and bringing it to us. And since I just mentioned Takumi Nieda, who I'll be interviewing with Arthur, she translated recently a very, very interesting and important book called The Color of the Sky is the Shape of the Heart. This is a Japanese novel, but it's written by a Zainichi Korean Japanese person. The author's name, I believe it's a pseudonym, is Chesil, like On Chesil Beach by Ian McEwan. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. I have no idea. Maybe it's Chursil. I really don't know, and I apologize for that. I should really find out from Takumi before the interview. If you don't know what a Zainichi Korean is, they kind of existed post World War II, post the fall of the Japanese Empire. When the Japanese Empire was a thing, they occupied the Korean peninsula, and that meant that Koreans made their way to Japan. And then after World War II, there was a whole Korean population in Japan. They are Japanese citizens, as far as I know. They live, they grow up, they have children, they die in Japan. They often speak both languages or just Japanese, especially their kids. And our protagonist in The Color of the Sky is the Shape of the Heart is a young Zainichi Korean girl who only speaks Japanese. She is Japanese, but her parents were Korean migrants. At the beginning of the book, she's in Oregon. She has moved to the US, and she's telling her story to a woman who has kind of taken her in this homestay. And we find out she went to a Japanese elementary school in Tokyo and then a Korean high school. But in the elementary school, she was bullied for being Korean. And in the high school, she didn't speak Korean. And so she's a person of two places and no places. And she went through a lot of terrible stuff. And it's a book that really shines a light on the Zainichi Korean culture and population in Japan. And if you don't know much about them, this book will really, really help you. It's fiction, but it's based on the author's own experiences, and I found it really, really useful, helpful, and important. The other book that I actually finished this month was Sorrowland by Rivers Solomon. I really don't want to say too much about this book. I did a video on it, and I'd like you to go watch it. If I ramble about it here now, I'm going to end up spoiling things or talking about it out of order. It's a book about the United States. It's a book about cults, religion, fanaticism, the relationship between the dominant Christian patriarchal white person, white man, and black people, black bodies, queer people, queer bodies, and Native Americans and Native American bodies. I think the word bodies here is really important, and I'm kind of quoting Roxane Gay, who's on the back, and I talk about that more in the video. But essentially it's a very American Gothic book about a cult, but it's exquisitely written and explores in very powerful and dramatic and scary ways the relationship between the powerful white patriarchy and queer, black, and native people. It's incredible. I also read some comics and manga. Now, I used to read a lot of comics. These are all my old comics from like 10 years ago. For a few years in university in my early 20s, I just collected so many DC and Marvel comics. I was more of a DC person because I like how camp and flamboyant and silly it all is. But I haven't read any Western comics in years because I've been traveling, living abroad, moving around. And so I read one. The other day I was at my parents' house and I picked up this book. The reason I picked this up is because I had just finished reading Wuthering Heights, which I'll talk about in a second. And I remembered that Wolverine Origin is a gothic novel in a sense. And I thought after reading Wuthering Heights, it would be interesting to read this. If you haven't read this, if you don't know anything about it, if you're surprised to hear that it's a gothic novel, it is. It tells the story of Wolverine when he was a child. Wolverine, if you don't know, is someone who can regenerate and heal from pretty much anything. And that means that he is old as hell, because he has a much longer lifespan than most people. And so this is set in sort of the, I think, 19th century, when he's a little boy living in a big mansion on a hill in Canada. He is raised by a very loving father, kind of a Bruce Wayne type, and a very hateful and nasty and grouchy grandfather. Their big mansion house has a groundskeeper who is a very, very grumpy, nasty, nihilistic bloke who has a son. And so the child of the mansion and the child of the groundskeeper become friends and hang out, and it's all told from the perspective of a young maid who also hangs out with the two boys. And it's so gothic in its setup, in its characters, in its setting, in its tone, in its pacing, in its dramatic flair. It's truly like Wuthering Heights or Rebecca. It really feels like that, except it's about Wolverine. But this is, yeah, it's a gothic novel. I was so pleasantly surprised by how much that translates to a comic about Wolverine. And as I said, I read Wuthering Heights. So I did a video on this just a few days ago. I love Wuthering Heights. It's one of my favorite books. I'm pretty bad at rereading literature, but there are two books that I reread really often. And that's Frankenstein, my favorite novel, and Wuthering Heights, which I guess it's probably my second favorite novel. I'm also going to start rereading more often, and I have an idea for a video series called Revisiting, where I will revisit books that I love, or books that I've never talked about before but I have read, I don't know, or maybe books that become relevant for some reason because there's a film coming out, something like that. I have like a list of books that I own, which I now have with me, that I want to revisit, so I think that's a thing I'm gonna do. Wuthering Heights, I revisited, and I adored it just as much as I always do. Go watch my video. Wuthering Heights is a beautiful, beautiful, horrible gothic novel full of romantic people, but no romance. These people are romantically obsessed with one another, but they are not romantic characters in any true sense, I guess. It's a gothic novel full of pain and death and suffering and agony and heartache, and I love it to bits. And as I already mentioned, comics and manga. I read a bunch of manga this month. I wrote a few really good manga-related articles that I'm super proud of that you can go read on the main site. And so I had to read loads of historical and fantasy manga. One of the best things that I read this month, one of the best manga I've ever read, and again I did a video on it, was Dick Fight Island by Reibun Ike. Dick Fight Island is an incredible boys' love manga. It is a very pornographic, very explicit, very erotic, gay manga about an archipelago where the 8 islands that make it up have a tournament to decide who the next king of the archipelago will be, and the tournament is just pornographic. It's explicit. It is amazing. And the way, I won't go into it, watch my video, but I argued in the video that it's a very wholesome manga in spite of how erotic and explicit it is. Dick Fight Island is also very, very wholesome. It's very warming, it's very kind, and it makes the argument that bloodshed and war and terror and aggression, all of these toxic masculine things essentially, are not a good idea. And actually, you can do democracy, and you can do war, and you can do sorting out arguments, and you can do tradition through sex and pleasure and love. And that's just so beautiful and kind and wholesome. I also read 2 fantasy manga I want to talk about because I think I might end up doing a dedicated video on both of these. One of them is called Delicious in Dungeon. Delicious in Dungeon, I was recommended by a brilliant YouTube channel called Lines in Motion. I'll link in the description. I might have mentioned their channel before. Lines in Motion is a manga channel, and I get so many manga recommendations from Lines in Motion. I'm going to end up mentioning them quite a lot because they recommend so much manga that flies under the radar. They introduced me to Witch Hat Atelier, which is a phenomenally drawn, wonderful Diana Wynne Jones-esque manga, and now they've recommended Delicious in Dungeon. If you love your fantasy manga or fantasy stories in general to be full of lore, you like a bestiary and you like all of these architectural details and historic details, Delicious in Dungeon does that because it's about a group of adventurers in a dungeon who end up figuring out that you can eat the monsters. And so they figure out you can spend more time in the dungeon because instead of bringing rations down from the surface, you can just keep adventuring through and eating the monsters. And so there's this whole bestiary of the ecosystem and the food chain and everything, and it's brilliant. I'll talk about it more when I do a video on it. And the other manga that I read, I can't remember who made it. I can't remember the mangaka's name, but it's called Ragna Crimson. And I also don't want to talk about this very much because this might be my next video. I really enjoyed Ragna Crimson. It's a grim-dark fantasy thing about dragons, and I don't ever hear anyone talk about it. I'm not that deep into manga circles on Twitter and social media, whatever, so I've probably just missed people talking about it, but I haven't seen anyone talk about it. I know it's only about 2 years old, and it's really, really fun. And so I think I'm going to do a little video on Ragna Crimson and why I like it. And finally, I am halfway through The Atlas 6 by Oliver Blake. This is, as one of these obnoxious stickers says, a TikTok sensation. I didn't want to read this, and then I got into a big argument with my friend Maria, and she sent it to me. I do this Secret Santa style book swap thing with a bunch of friends all around the world, and Maria sent me this. And she loved this book, and she said it's brainless fun, and it's chaotic, and silly YA fantasy yumminess. You're gonna love it or hate it, I don't know. I love it. I don't know if I love it for the right reasons, and that's why I want to do a whole video on it, because I have a lot of thoughts about this book, mostly negative, but they're the reason I like it. It's so hard to explain, and so I'm gonna have to give it a go. I'm gonna have to make some notes and do a really good video on it, because The Atlas 6 isn't very good, and I love it so much. I love this book. I love it in all of its chaotic, stupid, terrible pretentiousness. I think it's great. It's going to be really weird to do a video on this, but it's going to be really fun too. So this is what I'm halfway through. This will be a video I'll put out ASAP. I think that's everything. I read 8 books and 4 comics. I read actually a bunch more manga, but I'm not going to talk about them. Those were the 2 that I thought were really interesting to talk about. 3. Also, I've had so many new patrons join after my last video, and I don't honestly know how to process it. If you join the $10 and up tiers, you can join a monthly book club that I host towards the end of every month. I announce it on my Patreon page. It's so great. Thank you. Subscribe for books.